The hearing room was buzzing, not loud, not chaotic, but the kind of tension that felt like static in the air. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the long wooden table, flipping through a neatly organized binder. She was calm, centered, but she knew what was coming. Across the room, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene had already spoken once, derailing a conversation on education equity with comments about patriotic values and woke indoctrination. But that wasn't what lit the fuse. It was the look. That narrowed, calculating glare aimed directly at Jasmine, like she was measuring the exact second to strike. Jasmine wasn't new to this. She'd been underestimated in rooms like this since her first day in politics, since before that even. But today, she came prepared. Not just with numbers, not just with talking points, but with names, with facts, with proof. As Chairwoman Lynn asked for any final statements, Marjorie raised her hand sharply. "Yes, Madam Chair," she said, voice syrupy but sharp. "Before we adjourn, I'd like to address something I find deeply concerning." The room stilled slightly. Jasmine looked up, her pen now resting on the binder. "You keep talking about disparities and systemic failure," Greene said, her eyes locked on Jasmine. "But how can we trust the integrity of a system run by people who cry racism every time someone challenges their leadership? Aren't you just playing the victim, representative?" The air got thin, the kind of moment where people stop moving, stop coughing, stop typing, because something is about to happen. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She closed her binder slowly and placed both hands on the table. Marjorie leaned in slightly, finger extended in a sharp accusatory motion across the room. "You sit here," she continued, pointing at white people, "talking about systems, when really, maybe the problem is the people in charge of those broken cities." She was smiling now, not out of warmth, but performance, like she thought she'd scored. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just opened her binder again and turned to a tab marked Federal Disparities. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, controlled, razor sharp. "Congresswoman," she said, "you're right about one thing. People should be held accountable." She reached into her folder and pulled out a printed report. The seal of the U.S. Department of Education gleamed faintly under the overhead lights. "But if you're going to talk about leadership and failure, let's make sure we're using facts, not finger-pointing." The tension wasn't broken. It deepened, because everyone knew Jasmine was just getting started. The paper Jasmine laid on the table didn't look like much at first glance, just black and white text, some graphs, government letterhead. But in rooms like this, words on paper could feel like thunder. "This," Jasmine said, lifting the page slightly so the cameras could see, "is a 2023 audit by the Department of Education. It details funding disparities in public schools, by district, by state, by demographic breakdown." She tapped a section near the bottom with her index finger, calm but deliberate. "In your state, Congresswoman Greene, majority white school districts receive nearly $1,200 more per student than districts serving majority black or Latino populations. That's not a claim, that's data." Greene opened her mouth, but Jasmine kept going. "You want to talk about broken systems? Let's talk about underfunded schools in Atlanta, where students use science books from 2004. Let's talk about teachers buying supplies out of pocket in rural Clayton County. Or how about Flint, Michigan, where the pipes still aren't fixed, because someone said, 'Not now,' one too many times." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Across the room, eyes began to shift. Some aides typed faster. One senator leaned back, hand to chin. Jasmine flipped to a new page. "I've got receipts on more than school funding," she said. "Would you like to move on to healthcare next? Or should we talk about the housing disparities in your own state's 14th district?" Now Greene did interrupt. "I don't need a lecture from someone who—" But Jasmine cut in, voice steady as stone. "No, you need the truth, and maybe for once you'll hear it from someone who actually lives with the consequences of these policies." The air went even stiller. Greene sat back, folding her arms. Jasmine kept going, eyes scanning the room now. "See, it's easy to sit in Washington and talk about who failed whom. It's easy to label entire communities as broken while ignoring the structures that set them up to fail. She paused, then laid down the second page. This one was an image, a side-by-side of two public high schools, one pristine, with new turf and solar panels, the other crumbling, with boarded windows and overgrown grass. Guess which one is in a wealthy district? Guess which one is majority black? Nobody answered. Jasmine didn't expect them to. Every time someone says, "Pull yourself up," I ask, with what? With a school that can't keep the lights on? With a zip code that gets redlined on mortgage maps? With a hospital 3 bus rides away? She closed the binder with finality, not out of anger, but certainty. You pointed your finger at me. I'm pointing it at the system. And this time, no one had anything to say. The silence was thick, not the kind that came from confusion, but the kind that followed a truth too sharp to ignore. Jasmine had dropped the facts like bricks on a polished floor, and now the chamber was adjusting to the echo. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to zoom in tighter. Representative Crockett leaned back in her chair, not to retreat, but to let the moment breathe. A few seconds passed. No one moved to fill the silence. Not the chair, not Marjorie, not the aides. Then, almost too perfectly, a low voice from across the room broke the quiet. "Congresswoman Crockett," said Representative Holloway, a centrist from Illinois, "I believe what you're presenting is important. But surely we must also look at personal responsibility in these communities. The old argument, the standby. A soft pivot that tried to look neutral, but always leaned in the same direction." Jasmine turned her gaze to him, calm, unwavering. "I believe in personal responsibility too," she said, "but let's not pretend the starting line is the same for everyone." She pulled a third document from her binder, this one laminated, already creased from use. "This is a case study of 2 high school seniors, one from Marietta, Georgia, the other from West Dallas. Same GPA, same test scores. One got admitted to 5 colleges, the other received 3 rejections before getting waitlisted at their only in-state option." She looked around the room. "You want to know the difference? Zip code. And one family owned their home, while the other rented with 3 other families." The murmurs returned, this time edged with discomfort. Jasmine wasn't lecturing. She was peeling back layers the room had grown used to leaving untouched. Marjorie Greene, still fuming, leaned forward again. "So what? Now we're blaming society for every bad outcome?" Jasmine didn't blink. "No," she said softly. "I'm blaming the system that lets 2 kids with the same dream get 2 completely different chances." That line landed hard. Even a few members from across the aisle visibly shifted in their seats. Then Jasmine did something few expected. She reached into her folder and pulled out a letter, handwritten, creased, in pencil. "This was mailed to my office 2 months ago. It's from a student named Deshawn, 16 years old, lives in a housing project in Oak Cliff. He wrote, 'I don't think I'll ever leave this block, but I watched the hearings, and I think maybe one day I could try.'" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It stayed steady, the kind of steady that hits deeper than shouting ever could. "I keep this letter," she said, "because I know there are 1,000 Deshawns watching, hoping someone in this room gives a damn." And with that, the balance of the hearing shifted. No longer just a clash of ideologies, but a reckoning with reality. Marjorie Taylor Greene had waited long enough. Her face was tight, knuckles white around the pen she held. The restraint was slipping, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't a question. It was a line rehearsed for the cameras. "You keep talking about systemic problems and handwritten letters," Greene snapped. "But what about accountability? What about the fact that violent crime has skyrocketed in the very neighborhoods you represent? Are you going to read us another letter, or finally admit that your policies don't work?" She pointed her finger at Jasmine as she spoke, not subtly, but deliberately. The room inhaled. And then Jasmine moved, slowly. She reached into her folder. What she pulled out wasn't another letter. It was a packet, tabbed, indexed, color-coded, and it wasn't just facts. It was receipts. Since we're talking about crime, Jasmine said evenly. Let's start with who actually funds prevention and who votes against it. She placed the folder flat on the table, slid it across toward the camera angle. This includes every vote cast in the last 2 years on the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, community reinvestment initiatives, mental health programs in underserved districts, all with breakdowns by congressional district. She didn't look at Marjorie. She didn't have to. The numbers did the talking. For every community safety program you voted against, I can show you a police chief, a principal, or a parent who begged for that funding and was denied. Greene tried to interrupt. That's not... But Jasmine raised her hand calmly. I'm not finished. Her tone wasn't angry. It was exact, commanding, the kind of tone that made even committee chairs pause. You point your finger and talk about crime like it's an accusation. But I've sat with mothers in community centers, in hospital waiting rooms. I've held the hands of teenagers who lost siblings to street violence. And do you know what they ask? She looked up. They ask why Congress holds press conferences about their tragedies, but won't pass a single bill to stop the next one. Now the room wasn't just listening, it was watching. Watching a woman who didn't flinch when attacked, who didn't blink when accused, but who turned confrontation into clarity. And then came the line that would break the moment wide open. Jasmine leaned in, her voice low but unshakable. You call it a crime wave. I call it policy failure, and I refuse to let your fear-mongering distract from the fact that when real solutions come to this table, you vote no, every single time. Boom. Aide in the corner froze mid-typing. One of the reporters lifted their phone, not to record, but to tweet. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was clarity, the kind that exposes what's always been there, but suddenly, no one can pretend they didn't hear. The room had settled into that strange kind of hush. Not quiet, not still, just loaded. Marjorie Taylor Greene stared at the folder, but didn't touch it. Her usual arsenal, sound bites, barbs, and smirks, was no good here. Not when facts were laid out like evidence on a courtroom table. She shifted in her seat. You act like Democrats don't control these cities, don't write the budgets, don't hire the prosecutors. So if your neighborhoods are broken, why is that my fault? There it was. A return to the old playbook. Distraction by deflection. But Jasmine was ready. No one's asking you to own what you didn't break, she replied. But we are asking you to stop making it worse. She turned a page in the folder. Her voice stayed calm. This is a memo from 2021 showing that federal housing vouchers were cut for urban districts with rising eviction rates. You supported that cut. Flip. Here's an internal review from HUD noting that lead remediation programs were underfunded in schools in 6 states, including Georgia. That's your state. Flip. And here, a letter from the Georgia Association of Pediatricians pleading for expanded school-based clinics. Your office never responded. The flips weren't dramatic. They were deliberate, surgical. Greene opened her mouth, but for the first time, words stalled. Because this wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about paper trails. And Jasmine, she wasn't debating. She was testifying. You come to these hearings, Jasmine said, and weaponize pain. But when it's time to legislate, to fund what actually saves lives, you disappear. She placed her hands on the table, steady. This is not just political theater to me. This is my community's reality. And if you're uncomfortable with that reality, good. Because maybe that's where change starts. A camera light blinked on. Someone in the back let out the quietest damn. But the moment didn't belong to them. It belonged to the woman at the mic who hadn't raised her voice, but had raised the bar. Greene forced a smile, sharp, plastic, and said, You're good with the performance. I'll give you that. But Jasmine's response landed like a gavel. This isn't a performance. This is policy. The difference is, I live what you legislate. And with that, the hush in the room deepened. Not because it was over, because everyone realized Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. The atmosphere had thickened, not with chaos, but clarity. Cameras adjusted, pens stopped scribbling. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just making a point. She was shifting the gravity of the room. Marjorie Taylor Greene looked down again, fumbling with her pen like it might find her an exit. But the silence after Jasmine's words didn't offer her one. It only asked her to sit with it. That's when Chairwoman Ellis, who'd remained neutral until now, spoke. "Representative Crockett," she said, "could you elaborate on what you mean by living the legislation?" It was a polite request, but it gave Jasmine exactly what she needed. She leaned into the mic, voice low, like a story whispered in a library. "I was 15 when our electricity was cut for the third time that winter. My mom worked 2 jobs. She was never home, not because she didn't care, but because she had to choose groceries or heat." Greene shifted in her chair. The staffers behind her didn't move at all. "We heated water on the stove for baths," Jasmine continued. "We studied by candlelight some nights, not for nostalgia, but necessity. And every time someone said we needed to just work harder, my mother took another shift. But that didn't change the utility shutoff notice or the eviction threats. There was no drama in her tone. That's what made it so devastating." "This isn't ancient history," Jasmine said. "It's 2025, and there are still kids doing homework in shelters, still seniors rationing insulin, still families waiting on housing lists that haven't moved in years." Now she turned to Greene, not in anger, in something deeper. "You sit there and say it's about local failure. But when cities ask for federal support, you vote no. When we propose solutions, you post memes. When a child falls through the cracks, you ask where the parents were. But never, not once, do you ask what this system was doing when it was supposed to catch them." The audience behind the panel, press, interns, policy aides, had gone stone silent. No shifting, no phones, only the hum of live microphones. Greene folded her arms. "So what? You're blaming me for poverty now?" Jasmine didn't blink. "I'm blaming a mindset," she said. "One that punishes pain instead of solving it. One that calls poverty a personal flaw instead of a policy failure." Then she reached back into her binder. She pulled out a photo. A young girl, maybe 9, in a school hallway with paint peeling behind her, holding a backpack twice her size. "This is Mia," she said. "She lives in my district. She's late to school 3 times a week because the bus doesn't stop near her shelter. But she still shows up, still aces her spelling tests, still believes college is in reach." She turned to Greene. "Are you telling me Mia's failure is inevitable? That our job is to sit here and debate whether she deserves help or hope?" Greene didn't answer. Not because she couldn't, because she knew whatever she said next would echo, and not in her favor. The tension didn't burst. It crystallized, one sentence at a time. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She let the silence hang for a breath longer, then kept speaking, not for applause, but for clarity. "Here's the real question," she said, her voice firm but unwavering. "When did we decide that empathy was a liability in politics?" She glanced at the rows of seated representatives, each scribbling, some squirming. Greene didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her posture spoke volumes, arms crossed, eyes narrow. But the power had shifted. Jasmine turned back to the chair. "I reviewed Representative Greene's voting record last night," she continued. "She opposed the emergency rental assistance expansion. She blocked pandemic relief extensions for low-income renters. And she voted against the Urban Infrastructure Equity Act, which would have repaired 4,000 housing units in underserved districts, including her own." Greene sat up straight. "That's a mischaracterization," she snapped. Jasmine held up the bill summary. "It's a direct quote," she said. "Page 3, paragraph 7. Laughter didn't erupt, but the room breathed for the first time in minutes. And Jasmine wasn't done. "When people say they support families, they don't mean all families. When they talk about opportunity, they don't mean for every child. And when they stand in front of cameras to say we're divided, they never admit why." Greene tried to regain footing. "Are you suggesting I don't care about struggling families? That I'm intentionally harming people?" No, Jasmine said. I'm suggesting you've made a career of ignoring them. Because it's easier to win elections with fear than facts. There it was. The statement that changed the temperature of the room. Staffers from both sides shifted. Journalists scribbled. Clips were already being clipped. Greene fumed. This isn't about emotions, she snapped. This is about policy. Exactly, Jasmine said, nodding. Policy. The difference between a child having dinner or going to bed hungry, between someone getting evicted or keeping a roof, between survival and collapse, and you treat it like sport. That cut deep. It didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be true. The chairwoman cleared her throat, attempting to move the hearing along, but the current had shifted. Greene looked shaken, not broken, not defeated, but confronted, and that was the point. Jasmine didn't come to humiliate, she came to expose, not just Greene, but the system that empowered her, the narrative that excused cruelty as toughness, that framed compassion as weakness. The real climax wasn't a single line, it was the accumulation of truth, and the room, finally, was listening. When Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, there was no round of applause, no dramatic music, just silence. The kind that settles when everyone in the room knows something irreversible just happened. Representative Greene looked down at her notes, but she didn't turn the page. There was nowhere to turn. Jasmine's words weren't rhetorical flourishes, they were receipts. Hard, cold, undeniable. A few seats down, a freshman congresswoman whispered to her aide, "That clip's gonna be everywhere by tonight." She was right. But this wasn't just about a clip. It was about the moment a lie collapsed under the weight of lived experience. The chairwoman gavelled forward, shifting to the next speaker, but no one in the room, not really, was listening anymore. Everyone was still back there with Jasmine's voice in their ears, because she didn't just win an argument. She reframed the battlefield. Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed, microphones angled. "Representative Crockett, was that personal?" one asked. She paused. "It was never about me," Jasmine said. "It's about who gets forgotten when politics becomes performance." She didn't stop to elaborate. She never liked the spotlight. But the spotlight found her anyway. By that evening, a 58-second clip of her quiet dismantling of Greene's family values speech had been viewed 7 million times. No background music, no flashy edit, just the unflinching steadiness of a woman telling the truth. TikTok flooded with reactions. Some users were in tears, others sat in stunned silence. One caption read, "She didn't yell. She didn't mock. She just laid the truth bare." And the real surprise? The responses pouring in weren't just from her district in Texas. They came from places like rural Iowa, central Kentucky, upstate New York. People who didn't look like Jasmine, who didn't vote like her, but who saw something they couldn't ignore. One message stood out. A man from Greene's own state wrote, "I'm conservative, voted red all my life, but what you said today, that hit. My brother's on disability. My niece got evicted last winter, and nobody in Congress has ever talked about us like we mattered, until you." Back in her office, Jasmine sat with her team. The phones were still ringing. Aide after aide walked in with transcripts, interview requests, op-eds already going live. One of them asked, "So what do we do next?" She looked up, tired but calm. "We draft the bill," she said. "No performance, just policy." Because the truth was, winning a moment isn't the same as winning a future. And Jasmine Crockett was in this for the long haul, not for the headlines, but for the people who don't get microphones. This wasn't just a heated exchange in a congressional hearing. It was a moment that revealed something deeper, whose voice gets heard, whose truth gets buried, and who dares to bring it all to light. Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to turn the spotlight into a power play. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Instead, she spoke, calmly, clearly, and let the truth do what it always does when it's spoken with courage, cut through the noise. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She came armed with facts, with names, with stories, and she made sure the room had no choice but to listen, because this wasn't just about scoring points. It was about standing up for the silenced, the ignored, the overlooked. What Jasmine did wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reminder. Some people speak to perform, others speak to transform, and in that room, everyone knew which one she was.